In the summer of 1987, every farmer in Finney County, Kansas, knew two things about the alkali flat on the western edge of the Salazar Place. It was worthless, and it had always been worthless. The white crust that formed along the low ground after a rain wasn't soil. It wasn't even close to soil. It was a geological insult, a place where the water table pushed salt and sodium carbonate up through the clay until nothing could grow there except the occasional patch of pickleweed and the kind of despair that comes from owning land that doesn't work. Domingo Salazar had farmed around it for 31 years. His father had farmed around it before him. Neither of them had ever seriously considered farming it. You didn't farm the alkali flat. You drove around it. You fenced your cattle away from it. You wrote it off on your taxes as unproductive acreage, and you moved on to the fields that actually wanted to cooperate with you. Domingo ran 680 acres of winter wheat in those days, plus a small cow-calf operation on the pasture ground to the south. He was a methodical man, careful with his money and his time, the kind of farmer who kept his equipment maintained and his records in a green ledger book that lived on the kitchen counter between the salt shaker and the telephone. He wasn't a man who complained. He wasn't a man who boasted. He was a man who showed up every morning before the sun did and worked until the light ran out. And he'd done that for so long that the neighbors had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing the sound of a river when you live beside one long enough. His wheat yields were consistent. His cattle were healthy. His debts were manageable. By the standards of Finney County in the mid-1980s, Domingo Salazar was doing fine. The 68 acres of alkali flat sat in the northwest corner of his property like a scar that wouldn't heal. It showed up on the county plat maps as part of his total acreage, but nobody counted it when they talked about productive ground. The county extension agent had walked it once back in 1971, pressed his boot heel into the white crust near the center, and shaken his head the way men shake their heads at things that can't be fixed. The soil test came back with a pH of 9.8 and sodium saturation levels that would have killed a cactus. The agent had written a single word in his notes: remediation. Then he'd written the estimated cost of remediation next to it, and Domingo had looked at that number and put the paper in a drawer and never opened the drawer again. That was how things stood in the summer of 1987, when a 19-year-old woman named Nora Salazar came home from her first year at Kansas State University with a backpack full of soil science textbooks, a notebook she'd filled with cramped handwriting during a lecture series on halophytic agriculture, and an idea that her father was not going to like. Let me tell you about Nora Salazar because you need to understand who she was before you can understand what she did. And she's different from almost every character this channel has told you about. She wasn't an old-timer with accumulated wisdom and a machine in the barn that nobody else remembered how to run. She was 19 years old. She'd grown up on that farm, had walked the edges of the alkali flat 100 times, had heard her father say the same thing about it 100 times, and somewhere along the way she had stopped accepting the explanation and started asking the question underneath it. Not why can't we grow wheat there, but what can grow there. Those are different questions. The first one accepts the premise, the second one doesn't. She'd found the answer in a soil science course taught by a professor named Dr. Elaine Forsyth, a compact woman from western Nebraska who had spent 15 years studying halophytic grasses, plants that don't just tolerate salt but require it. Inland saltgrass, Distichlis spicata. A native perennial that had evolved specifically for the kind of ground the alkali flat represented. Dr. Forsyth had shown her students field trial data from Colorado and New Mexico, yield estimates, nutritional profiles, grazing capacity numbers. She had explained that saltgrass, properly managed, could produce hay of adequate nutritional quality for cattle, that it required no irrigation beyond what the saline water table naturally provided, that it needed no fertilizer because the sodium and mineral content of the soil was, for this plant, not a problem, but a resource. She had said, quietly, at the end of the lecture, that there were probably tens of thousands of acres of alkali ground across the Great Plains, sitting idle because nobody had thought to ask what they were actually good for. Nora had written that sentence down and underlined it twice. Let me tell you about the science, because this is the part that matters, and it's the part that most people in Finney County in 1987 had never heard. Distichless spicata is not a compromise crop. It's not what you plant when you've given up on something better. It's a plant that has spent 10,000 years of evolutionary pressure becoming exactly what alkali ground needs. Its root system goes down 4 to 6 feet, pulling moisture from the saline water table that sits just below the surface of flats like the one on the Salazar place. It doesn't need that water to be fresh. It processes the salt through specialized cells in its leaves, excreting excess sodium through glands that leave a faint white residue on the blade surface. The plant, in other words, manages the same chemistry that makes the ground inhospitable to everything else. The nutritional profile of saltgrass hay runs between 6 and 9% crude protein at peak cutting, which is lower than alfalfa but comparable to native grass hay, and adequate for cow-calf operations and backgrounding cattle. The yield per acre on properly established stands runs between 1 and 2 tons per cutting, with 2 cuttings possible in a Kansas growing season. On 68 acres of ground that was currently producing nothing, not $1, not a pound of beef, not a single bale, even the low end of that estimate represented somewhere between 68 and 136 tons of hay per year from land that the county had written off as a geological insult. Nora had done the math in her notebook on the drive home from Manhattan. She'd done it 3 times to make sure she hadn't made an error. Then she'd looked out the window at the Kansas landscape going by and thought about the alkali flat and thought about her father and thought about how she was going to explain this to him. The kitchen conversation happened on a Tuesday evening in June after supper, while her mother Elena was washing dishes and her father was reading the Farm Bureau newsletter at the table. Nora sat down across from him and put her notebook on the table between them and said she wanted to talk about the flat. Domingo looked up from his newsletter. He looked at the notebook. He looked at his daughter. He said, "What about it?" It wasn't really a question. She walked him through it. The plant, the science, the yields, the math. She showed him the field trial data she'd photocopied at the university library, pages from Extension Service publications out of Colorado State, a summary of a grazing study from New Mexico that Dr. Forsyth had distributed in class. She explained the establishment process, seeding in late summer, a full year of establishment before first cutting, the need to fence the flat separately and manage it as its own unit. She told him what seed cost. She told him what fencing would cost. She told him what the break-even point was and how long it would take to reach it. Domingo listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He picked up one of the photocopied pages and looked at it. He set it back down. He said, "That's Colorado." Nora said yes. He said, "We're not Colorado." She said the soil chemistry was comparable, that Dr. Forsyth had reviewed the county soil survey data and said the flat was a good candidate. He was quiet again. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it down. He said, "I need to think about it." Elena Salazar, who had not turned around from the sink during any of this, said, without turning around, "She's right, you know." Domingo looked at the back of his wife's head for a moment. Then he looked at his daughter. Then he looked at the notebook. He said, "I said I need to think about it." He thought about it for 3 weeks. Let me tell you about what happened when Nora took the idea to the Finney County Co-op, because that's where things got complicated, in the way that things always get complicated when someone young brings an unfamiliar idea into a room full of people who have been doing things the same way for a long time. She hadn't planned to go to the co-op. She'd gone to pick up a parts order for her father, and she'd run into Gene Crowley at the counter. Gene Crowley was not a bad man. Let me be clear about that, because it would be easy to make him into a villain, and he wasn't one. He was 58 years old and had managed the Finney County Co-op for 22 of those years, and he knew more about what grew in Finney County and what didn't than almost anyone in the region. He'd seen farmers come in with ideas before. He'd seen what happened to most of them. He had a kind of institutional memory that had calcified over the decades into institutional certainty, and that certainty was not malicious. It was just immovable. Gene Crowley knew what worked in Finney County, and saltgrass on the Alkali Flat was not on the list. She made the mistake, or maybe the brave decision, of mentioning it while she was waiting for the parts order to be pulled. She said she'd been reading about saltgrass establishment on alkali ground, and that she thought the flat on her family's place might be a candidate. Gene was standing behind the counter with his coffee, and he looked at her the way a man looks at something that doesn't quite compute. Then he smiled. It was a patient smile, the kind that adults give children when children say something that is technically a sentence but not quite a thought. He said, "Saltgrass." She said yes. He said, "On the Salazar Alkali Flat." She said yes. He said, "Nora, that flat has been there since before your grandfather bought the place. There's a reason nobody's done anything with it." The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Gene Crowley started laughing. Not a mean laugh. That's important to understand. It was a laugh of genuine amusement, the laugh of a man who has heard something so far outside the boundaries of what he considers possible that his body produces laughter as a reflex, the way your knee jerks when a doctor taps it. He turned to the two farmers standing at the end of the counter, Wes Sievert and his brother-in-law, who were waiting on a seed order, and he said, "You hear this? Domingo's girl wants to grow hay on the Alkali Flat." Wes Sievert looked at Nora and looked at Gene and said, "What kind of hay?" Gene said, "Saltgrass." Wes Sievert made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a word. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched someone laugh at an idea and understood in the moment of the laugh exactly what the laugh was protecting? Gene Crowley wasn't laughing at Nora Salazar. He was laughing at the suggestion that 30 years of collective knowledge about that flat might be incomplete. He was laughing because the alternative, that a 19-year-old girl with a semester of soil science and a photocopied extension bulletin had seen something that nobody in Finney County had thought to look for, was genuinely uncomfortable to consider. The laugh was easier. The laugh kept everything in its place. Nora picked up her parts order when it came up. She thanked Gene. She walked out to her truck. She sat in the cab for a moment and looked at the steering wheel. Then she drove home. That evening, Domingo Salazar came in from the field and found his daughter at the kitchen table with her notebook open and a pencil in her hand. He washed up at the sink. He dried his hands. He sat down across from her and said, "Gene Crowley called me today." She said she figured he might. Domingo was quiet. He looked at the notebook. He looked at his daughter's face. He said, "He thinks it's a bad idea." Nora said she knew. Domingo said, "I talked to your mother." He was quiet again for a moment. He said, "The flat's 68 acres. I'll give you 30 to start. If it works, we talk again." She had her permission. The fencing went up in August of 1987. Nora did most of it herself, with help from her younger brother on the weekends, running woven wire around the perimeter of the 30-acre section she'd marked out on the western end of the flat. The ground was hard in the dry summer heat, and the white alkali crust cracked under their boots and left a chalky residue on their jeans. Her brother complained about the smell. Alkali ground has a faint mineral smell in the heat, something between baking soda and old clay. Nora didn't complain. She drove posts and ran wire and thought about root depths and establishment timelines and the field trial data from Colorado that she'd read until the pages were soft from handling. She seeded in late August, broadcasting Distichlus spicata seed across the prepared surface using a rented seeder that she'd calibrated herself based on the seeding rate recommendations in the extension bulletin. The seed was not cheap. The total cost of seed, fencing materials, and equipment rental came to $2,340, which was money the Salazar operation did not have to spare. Domingo had agreed to fund it from the equipment maintenance account, which meant something else would have to wait. He didn't say what, he just signed the check and handed it to her and said, "It better work." She said it would. The establishment year was the hardest part. Distichlus spicata germinates slowly on alkali ground. and the first month after seeding produced nothing visible. Just the white crust and the occasional pickleweed and the certainty which Nora felt every time she walked the flat that she had made a catastrophic mistake. Her father walked it with her once in September and didn't say anything. That silence was its own kind of pressure. She went back to Kansas State in the fall and spent the year studying and worrying and writing letters home, asking her mother to check the flat and report what she saw. The reports were not dramatic. October. Some germination visible near the low center where moisture was highest. November. Stand patchy but present. December. Dormant, hard to assess. March. Green showing in the low areas. May. Stand coverage estimated at 60 to 70% of seeded area. Nora read each letter at her desk in the dormitory and felt the slow accumulation of something that might become proof. She came home in the summer of 1988 and walked the flat on her first morning back. The stand was uneven, dense in the low center where the water table was closest to the surface, thin on the higher edges where the soil was drier. But it was there. Distichless spicata, knee-high in the center, its narrow blue-green blades moving in the July wind, looking like nothing else in Finney County because nothing else in Finney County had been asked to grow there. She stood at the edge of the flat and looked at it for a long time. Then she went in for breakfast. She did not cut it that year. The establishment guidelines were clear. Let the stand develop through the first full growing season. Allow the root system to consolidate. Do not graze or cut until the second year. This was the hardest thing she'd ever done on a farm, standing next to something that looked like it might be working and not touching it. Her father walked the flat in August and looked at the stand and said, That was all. But he said it in a way that was different from silence. Gene Crowley heard about the stand through the network of information that moves through a rural county the way water moves through soil, slowly, invisibly, and everywhere at once. He stopped by the Salazar place in September of 1988, ostensibly to talk to Domingo about a co-op seed program, and he walked out to the edge of the flat and looked at the grass. He stood there for a moment. He said, "Well, it grew." He said it the way a man says something he was hoping he wouldn't have to say. Then he said, "Let's see what it cuts at." He drove away. His smile, Nora noticed, was still there, but it had gotten smaller. Let me tell you about the first cutting, in July of 1989, because that's where the numbers started to mean something. Nora was 21 years old and had just finished her junior year. She cut the 30-acre stand with her father's swather on a Monday morning, raked it Wednesday, baled it Friday. The bales came off the flat in the late afternoon heat, and she and her brother stacked them on the wagon and counted them as they went. The final count was 94 round bales from 30 acres. She weighed a sample bale on the grain elevator scale in Garden City. It came in at 1,180 pounds. She did the math on the drive home. 94 bales at 1,180 pounds was 110,920 pounds of hay. That was 55.4 tons from 30 acres. That was 1.85 tons per acre, which was at the high end of the field trial projections from Colorado, and it was from ground that, 12 months earlier, had been producing nothing. She had the hay tested at the K-State Extension Lab. The results came back at 7.8% crude protein and 52% total digestible nutrients. Adequate for cow-calf pairs. Adequate for backgrounding. Not alfalfa, but not nothing. Definitively not nothing. She priced it against the local hay market. Native grass hay was trading at $42 per ton that summer. Her 55.4 tons at $42 represented $2,328 in potential revenue from 30 acres that had previously generated $0. The fencing and seeding costs had been $2,340. She had nearly covered her entire establishment investment in a single cutting from a partial stand in its first production year. If she took a second cutting in September, which the stand looked capable of supporting, she would be in positive territory before the end of the season. She put all of this in a letter to Dr. Forsyth at Kansas State. Dr. Forsyth wrote back within a week and asked if she could include the data in a presentation she was preparing for the High Plains Agricultural Conference. Nora said yes. The second cutting came in at 38 bales, lighter, as expected in the drier September conditions, but still real. Combined with the first cutting, the 1989 season produced 93.4 tons from 30 acres. At $42 per ton, that was $3,922.80 in revenue. Her establishment costs were covered. She was $1,582.80 ahead on ground that had been worth nothing. She showed her father the numbers that evening. Domingo sat at the kitchen table and looked at the ledger page she'd prepared. The costs, the yields, the revenue, the net. He was quiet for a while. He picked up his coffee. He set it down. He said, "You want to expand to the full 68 acres?" It wasn't a question. She said yes. He said, "What does it cost to fence the rest?" She told him. He was quiet again. Then he said, "We'll talk to the bank in January." The bank approved the expansion in February of 1990. The remaining 38 acres of the flat were fenced and seeded that spring. By 1991, the full 68-acre stand was in production. The combined yield that year, first and second cutting, full flat, was 201 tons of saltgrass hay. At the going rate for native grass hay, that was $8,442 in revenue from ground that the county extension agent had written off in 1971 with a single word and a cost estimate that nobody had opened again. Let me tell you about what the neighbors were doing during those years, because that's the context that makes what happened in 1996 so significant. The farms around the Salazar place were running winter wheat, as they had always run winter wheat, as their fathers had run winter wheat, as the county had run winter wheat since before any of them were born. Finney County was wheat country. The identity of the land and the identity of the people who farmed it were so thoroughly intertwined that suggesting an alternative felt less like a farming decision and more like a cultural betrayal. The co-op existed to support wheat and milo and the cattle that ate the wheat stubble. The equipment dealers sold equipment calibrated to wheat production. The conversations at the co-op counter in the morning were about wheat prices, wheat weather, wheat problems, wheat solutions. Wheat was not a crop in Finney County. It was a worldview. The hay market in southwest Kansas in those years was served primarily by alfalfa from the irrigated ground along the river bottoms and native grass hay from the upland pastures. Both were adequate. Both were established. Neither was 68 acres of saltgrass on an alkali flat that everyone had agreed was worthless. When farmers drove past the Salazar place on the county road and saw the fenced flat with its blue-green grass standing in the summer heat, they slowed down and looked. Some of them stopped. A few of them asked Domingo about it at the grain elevator. He told them to ask his daughter. Most of them didn't. Gene Crowley had stopped talking about the saltgrass project by 1991. He hadn't started talking about it in any positive way. He had simply stopped mentioning it, the way you stop mentioning a bet you lost. At the co-op counter, if someone brought it up, he would say, "Domingo's girl has got something going out there," in a tone that communicated respect and discomfort in roughly equal measure, and then he would change the subject. Nora graduated from Kansas State in 1991 with a degree in agronomy and came home to the farm. She was 23 years old, and she had been right about the flat, and she knew it, and she did not say so to anyone except her mother once on the back porch in the evening when Elena asked her how it felt. Nora said it felt like being in the right place. Elena said that was a good way to feel. They sat on the porch and watched the sun go down over the flat, where the saltgrass was moving in the evening wind, and neither of them said anything else. By 1993, the saltgrass operation was generating consistent annual revenue of $7,800 to $9,200 from the 68-acre flat, depending on rainfall and market prices. The Salazar cow-calf operation had expanded from 45 pairs to 78 pairs, partly because they now had a reliable hay supply from the flat to supplement winter feeding. Domingo had begun letting Nora manage the hay enterprise entirely, the cutting schedule, the pricing, the sales. He still ran the wheat and the cattle, but the flat was hers. He said so at the dinner table one evening in the fall of 1993, when the subject came up in front of the whole family. He said, The flat is Nora's operation. She decides what happens there. He said it simply, the way he said most things, but everyone at the table understood what it meant. It was not a small thing for Domingo Salazar to say. The hay was selling locally by then. A few neighboring cow-calf operators who had discovered that saltgrass hay, while not as rich as alfalfa, was significantly cheaper and adequate for their winter feeding programs. Nora had priced it at $38 per ton, slightly below native grass hay, to build the customer base. She had 4 regular buyers by 1994. She had 6 by 1995. She kept records of everything in a notebook that had replaced the photocopied extension bulletins as her primary working document. Yields by cutting, moisture at cutting, protein test results, customer names, delivery dates, payment terms. The notebook was green, the same color as her father's ledger book, and it lived on the kitchen counter in the same spot. Let me tell you about the summer of 1995, because that's when the weather started doing what Kansas weather does when it wants to remind everyone who's actually in charge. The winter of 1994 to 95 had been dry. The spring of 1995 was drier. By June, the soil moisture deficit across southwest Kansas was severe enough that the Extension Service was issuing drought advisories, and the farmers who grew dryland wheat were watching their yield estimates fall week by week. The alfalfa producers on the irrigated ground were running their pivots around the clock and watching their water bills climb. The upland pastures were going brown early. The native grass hay producers were looking at their stands and doing the math on how many bales they were going to come up short. Nora walked the flat in June of 1995 and found the saltgrass standing green. The water table on the flat was, if anything, slightly higher than normal. Drought years concentrate the subsurface moisture in the low ground, and the alkali flat was the lowest ground on the Salazar property. The saltgrass was pulling from that water table the way it had evolved to do, indifferent to the rainfall deficit that was punishing everything else in the county. She cut the flat in early July and took 61 tons from the first cutting. She cut it again in September and took 29 tons. Total for the 1995 season, 90 tons, slightly below her best years but well within normal range, from a year when the hay market in southwest Kansas was beginning to tighten in ways that most people hadn't noticed yet. She noticed. She priced her 1995 hay at $44 per ton and sold it all before September. The winter of 1995 to 96 was the one that changed things. Let me tell you about it, because the story doesn't end with the saltgrass standing green in a drought year. The story ends with what happened when the drought didn't end. The winter of 1995 to 96 brought almost no snow to southwest Kansas. The subsoil moisture that farmers count on to carry winter wheat through the spring was not there. By February of 1996, the agricultural press was using the word crisis with a regularity that made farmers uncomfortable because agricultural journalists, as a rule, are not given to alarm. The winter wheat crop across the southern Great Plains was in serious trouble. The pasture condition reports coming out of the USDA were the worst in a decade. And the hay market, the market for the feed that cattle producers depend on when their pastures can't carry their herds, was beginning to move in a direction that nobody who was short on hay wanted to see. By March of 1996, native grass hay in southwest Kansas was trading at $68 per ton. By April, it was $82. By May, as it became clear that the wheat crop was going to be a partial failure across a wide swath of the region and that the summer pastures were not going to recover without significant rainfall, hay prices in some parts of Kansas and Oklahoma were touching $95 and $100 per ton. Cattle producers who had sold off their hay stocks in the fall, expecting normal winter conditions, were scrambling. Some of them were selling cattle they didn't want to sell because they couldn't afford to feed them. The phone at the Harney County Co-op was ringing constantly with farmers asking about hay availability, and Gene Crowley's answer, more often than not, was that there wasn't much to be had at any price. Nora Salazar had 68 acres of saltgrass standing green on the Alkali flat. She had not sold her 1995 second cutting hay. She'd held 29 tons in the barn through the winter, which was unusual for her. She normally moved everything before December. But she'd watched the weather in January and February, and she'd looked at the soil moisture reports, and she'd made a decision to hold. It was not a complicated decision. It was the decision of someone who had spent 9 years learning to read the relationship between weather and forage supply, and who had, in her notebook, 9 years of data to read from. In March of 1996, she sold the 29 stored tons at $72 per ton. That was $2,088 from hay she'd produced the previous fall at a cost of roughly $8 per ton to cut, rake, bale, and store. She reinvested the revenue into the operation and waited for the growing season. The 1996 first cutting came off the flat in early July. The salt grass was, again, green and dense. The water table on the flat had not declined appreciably. Alkali flats in drought years are counterintuitive that way, their subsurface hydrology operating on a different cycle than the surrounding upland. She cut 64 tons from the first cutting. The hay market in July of 1996 was at $88 per ton for native grass equivalent. She priced her saltgrass hay at $80 per ton, a discount to the market because she had regular customers she wanted to keep and because she was not, by temperament, a person who extracted maximum profit from a neighbor's crisis. She sold 50 tons in the first week. The phone kept ringing. Gene Crowley called on a Thursday in the second week of July. Nora was in the barn when her mother came out to get her. Elena said Gene Crowley was on the phone and wanted to talk about hay. Nora wiped her hands on her jeans and went inside. She picked up the receiver. Gene said, "Nora, Gene Crowley." She said she knew. He said, "I've got 3 operators who are in a bad spot. Short on hay, can't find any at a reasonable price. I told them I'd make some calls." He paused. "I heard you've got some saltgrass hay available." She said she did. He said, "What are you getting for it?" She told him. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "That's fair." Another pause. "I didn't think that flat would amount to much back when you started." Nora was quiet for a moment. She said, "I know." You laughed. Not mean. Not triumphant. Just a statement of fact, delivered the way her father delivered most things, simply, without decoration. Gene Crowley was quiet on his end of the line. She said, "I can take all 3 of your operators. Tell them to call me directly and we'll work out delivery." Gene said he would. He said, "Thank you, Nora." She said, "Thank you for calling." She hung up the phone. Elena was standing in the kitchen doorway. She said, "Gene Crowley?" Nora said yes. Elena said, "What did he want?" Nora said, "He wanted hay." Elena looked at her daughter for a moment. Then she went back to what she was doing. "Let me tell you about what the 1996 season meant in numbers, because the numbers are the argument, and the argument deserves to be made clearly. The Salazar saltgrass flat produced 64 tons in the first cutting and 31 tons in the second, for a total of 95 tons in the 1996 season, at an average selling price of $80 per ton, accounting for the held-over 29 tons from 1995 sold at $72, and the 1996 production sold at prices ranging from $80 to $85. The total hay revenue for the Salazar operation in the 1995 to 96 cycle was $10,636. From 68 acres of alkali ground that the county extension agent had written off in 1971, from ground that Gene Crowley had laughed at in 1987, from ground that Wes Sievert had made a sound about that was not quite a laugh and not quite a word. The neighboring wheat operations that same year were looking at partial crop failures, emergency hay purchases at $88 to $100 per ton, and the kind of financial stress that comes from a single crop system encountering a single bad year. The Salazar wheat ground had also suffered. Domingo's yields were down 30% from the 5-year average, but the saltgrass hay revenue had not suffered. It had, if anything, increased because the drought that punished the wheat had not reached the water table that fed the flat. The 2 enterprises, wheat and saltgrass, were not correlated. When one went down, the other did not necessarily follow. That was not an accident. That was the point. Nora had written the point down in her notebook in 1987, in the margins of the photocopied extension bulletin, in the cramped handwriting she'd used since high school. She'd written, "Any farm that grows only one thing is a farm that needs only one disaster to fail." She'd written it after reading something Dr. Forsyth had said in lecture, and she'd underlined it, and she'd thought about the alkali flat, and she'd thought about what it meant to have 68 acres of land that was immune to the disaster that could take everything else. Let me tell you about what happened in the years after 1996, because the story doesn't end with the hay shortage. It never ends where you think it's going to end. By 1998, 4 other farms in Finney County had established saltgrass stands on their own alkali ground. 3 of them had called Nora directly for advice. One of them had called the K-State Extension Office, which had connected them with Dr. Forsyth, who had connected them with Nora's field trial data, which Nora had shared freely and without charge. The Extension Service published a bulletin in 1999, Saltgrass Hay Production on Alkali Soils in southwest Kansas, that cited the Salazar operation as its primary case study. Nora was listed as a contributing author. She was 31 years old. Gene Crowley retired from the co-op in 2001. At his retirement party at the Finney County Fairgrounds, he said a few words about the changes he'd seen in his 22 years, and he mentioned, specifically, the Saltgrass project on the Salazar place. He said it had taught him something about the difference between knowing what works and knowing what's possible. He said he'd laughed at the idea in 1987, and that he'd been wrong to laugh and that he wanted to say so publicly. He looked at Nora when he said it. She was standing near the back of the room with her mother and her father, who was 71 by then and walking with a cane. She nodded at Gene Crowley. He nodded back. That was the apology and the acceptance of it, conducted in the language of people who don't make speeches about feelings. Domingo Salazar died in the spring of 2004 at 74 years old in the farmhouse where he'd lived his entire adult life. He'd farmed until 2 years before his death, when his knees finally made the decision for him. The green ledger book was still on the kitchen counter between the salt shaker and the telephone. Nora found it there the morning after he died and sat at the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. She didn't open it. She already knew what was in it. The funeral was at the church in Garden City, and more people came than the family had expected. Farmers Nora didn't know by name. A man who introduced himself as a county commissioner. The current manager of the co-op, who had been a teenager when Nora fenced the flat. Dr. Forsyth drove down from Manhattan, which was 4 hours, and stood in the back of the church in her good coat. After the service, she found Nora in the parking lot and said, "Your father was a brave man." Nora said she thought so too. Dr. Forsyth said, "It takes a certain kind of courage to say yes to something you don't understand yet." Nora thought about that for a moment. She said, "He said no first. Dr. Forsyth said, yes. And then he said yes. That's the part that matters." Let me tell you about the summer of 2009, because that's when the story picked up the thread that Nora had been carrying for 22 years and handed it to the next generation. Her daughter, Maya, named for Elena's mother, was 17 years old and had spent the summer reading about cover crops and soil biology and a method called adaptive multipaddock grazing that a researcher in South Africa had been developing for degraded rangeland. Maya had a notebook. It was blue. She came to the kitchen table one evening in August and put it in front of her mother. She said she wanted to talk about the wheat ground. Nora looked at the notebook. She looked at her daughter. She thought about a Tuesday evening in June of 1987, and a green notebook on a kitchen table, and a man reading a Farm Bureau newsletter who had looked up and said, "What about it?" in a way that was not quite a question. She thought about what it had cost to be right about the flat, and what it had cost to be wrong, and what it had cost her father to say yes to something he didn't fully understand. She thought about Dr. Forsyth standing in the parking lot saying, "That's the part that matters." She said, "Tell me what you're thinking." Maya told her. She walked her through the research. the soil biology, the grazing rotation data, the carbon sequestration numbers from the South African trials, the cover crop species mixes that were showing results in Nebraska and the Dakotas. She was 17 years old, and she had the kind of certainty that comes from reading something true and recognizing it. Nora listened to all of it without interrupting. When Maya finished, Nora was quiet for a moment. She looked at the blue notebook. She thought about the 1996 hay shortage and the green salt grass on the Alkali flat, and the phone call from Gene Crowley, and the sound that Wes Sievert had made that was not quite a laugh and not quite a word. She thought about what it means to look at a piece of ground and ask not, "Why can't this work?" but, "What could this become?" She said, "Which fields do you want to start with?" Maya looked at her. She said, "You're not going to say you need to think about it?" Nora said, "I already thought about it. 22 years ago." She pulled the blue notebook toward her and opened it to the first page. She said, "Show me the rotation." The Alkali flat is still there, in the northwest corner of what is now the Salazar Reyes operation, 68 acres of Distichlis spicata in its 37th year of production. The stand has thickened and deepened over the decades, the root system now reaching 6 feet into the mineral-rich water table below, the grass returning every spring without replanting, without irrigation, without fertilizer, from ground that the county wrote off before Nora Salazar was born. The notebook, the original green one with the photocopied extension bulletins folded inside the back cover, sits in the top drawer of the desk in the farm office. Nora takes it out sometimes and looks at the margins where she wrote things down in 1987, the yield projections and the cost estimates and the sentence she underlined twice. The flat still cuts twice a year. The hay still sells. The phone still rings in dry years. She fenced the Alkali flat in 1987. They laughed. The drought came, the wheat suffered, the salt grass didn't, the hay shortage hit. The flat was the only thing still producing, and the notebook is still in the drawer.